We've already spent a lot of time in the Lascaux Caves, but I want to return to our big four analytical categories and use them to look at this work briefly once again. So what do we know about the function of this work? Not a whole lot in the end, although we have intriguing clues. Its function does not appear to be hunting instruction. Those weren't the animals these people hunted. The dark, narrow spaces where the paintings are found suggest secret rituals for a few selected individuals rather than group gatherings. The most recent theory is that the paintings represented or maybe even induced shamanistic trances, but really we simply don't know. Just for a point of contrast, what would you guess about the function of this famous work of prehistoric and historic art, which I'm betting many of you recognize from near Canyonlands National Park in Utah? This huge slab of rock stands next to the one water source in the area, Indian Creek, so lots of people would have passed this way. So here's a close-up of one section. Notice anything that seems out of place? How about the guy on horseback holding a bow and reins? We know, in fact, that people from several cultures, the Anasazi, the Fremont, the Ute, and maybe the Navajo, carved images into this panel over the past 1,500 years. It seems likely, given the prominent, convenient location, that this did indeed function as a kind of public bulletin board. Bring home some elk bones, dear, I'm making soup. The content, on the other hand, seems strikingly similar to what we see in the European Paleolithic caves, an admixture of animals and people, feet, geometric forms, and what looks like a shaman figure, leaving aside the much later fellow on horse. Whatever its function, this was much more public art. Back to Lascaux. We talked briefly about technique, the use of animal fat to bind paints and scaffolding to paint high in the caves. Archaeologists have determined that the Lascaux artists did not use paintbrushes. The broad black outlines of the figures were probably created with mats, pats, or swabs of moss or hair, even blobs of raw color sprayed through hollow bones. In other words, the Lascaux artists likely used three graphic techniques: painting, drawing, and engraving, sometimes independently and sometimes in combination. For the great black bull, for example, archaeologists think that the head and most of the body were spray painted, while a pad of some sort, acting like a brush, was used to paint the upper part and the tail. Contours were drawn in with the edged chunks of manganese or iron oxide. In addition, thicker engraved, that is, etched in, carved in lines were sometimes used to give added volume and relief to the outlines of the animal figures. Again, these were amazingly sophisticated artists. We'll talk a lot more about all of these techniques. Consider this another trailer. And now let's turn to form. What kind of lines do you observe in these Lascaux images? Well, the bull on the upper right shows clear contour lines. The line of the equines, by contrast, is created by color. There are no explicit color lines. What about shapes? Otherwise, I should have said the bull in the upper left. The reindeer's horns seem organic, if not extraterrestrial, while the dots below it are much more geometric. And we talked about this last time. Is there a focal point? Not really. Again, partly because images were painted over a long period of time. Dramatic as these works are, they do not display much formal composition. We run into a similar problem interpreting our next image, the running horned woman. She is surrounded by other images, but many do not date from the same period. Note that some of the smaller figures are actually superimposed over her body. This, too, is a cave painting, but these caves were shallow and inhabited, suggesting again a more public art, like that found on newspaper rock. Any other ways this reminds you of Utah? Actually, like southern Utah, this region of Algeria was once much wetter. During the Neolithic era, enough rainfall fell to allow a pastoral lifestyle, that is, the herding of domesticated animals. Over time, the climate changed and the area dried. Intriguingly, the subjects of the art changed with the climate as well. Camels, for example, replaced cows. Let's watch this short video which introduces you to the region and its art. So here's our running horned woman again, juxtaposed with some of the other rock art from Tassili. What do you notice about the content of these works as compared, say, with the paintings in Lascaux? Well, we see a lot more people and a lot more scenes of daily life. Note that the hunters in the upper right and the women and children in the upper left are figures that do not appear in Lascaux. However, the painting in the right bottom corner, which you also saw in the video, seems to have a more supernatural content. So where does our running horn woman fit into this cast of characters? We don't really know, but she could be performing a ritual dance. That seems to be the leading hypothesis, especially since she seems to be decorated with paint or scars, decorations still found in the traditions of people in this area. But she also might be a goddess or imitating a goddess, because horns are often associated with gods. Here are some other horn deities we will encounter in this course from a wide variety of cultures. So why would you guess are horns often associated with deities all around the world? There is no way this is not going to sound sexist. Sorry. Horns are found primarily on large male animals, and they are used primarily to fight. Usually the most dominant bulls, that is, male cattle, bison, elk, etc., have the biggest and most impressive horns. So horns were a logical symbol of strength, virility, and triumph over foes. Consider it iconographic chest thumping. Now, one of your readings presented an alternative, or really a related theory. What was it? Well, one author speculated that the woman was performing a dance associated with rain. Note the speckles surrounding her face and what looks like a rainbow held by the woman below her. It's an intriguing theory, and it's certainly plausible in a pastoral culture where rain was necessary for more abundant grass for cattle. We've talked about content and context. What do you think the function of this and other rock art was? Well, maybe the artists were making magic. Maybe they were just capturing their daily lives, following that human impulse to create art that we will be exploring all year long. So, finally, any observations you want to make about form? Well, again, I see strong contour lines. Notice the white lines contrasting with the black interiors. The draped material on her sleeves overlapping her arms creates a sense of volume. The lines are likewise vertical, which emphasizes, again, strength and power. So I did not create this splendid graphic, some other art history teacher did, but I want to use it to make an important point. We are looking for and finding similarities across very disparate cultures. Please do not leap to the assumption that these cultures influenced each other. Instead, think about what common human experiences might produce commonalities in art. On to our next required work. The subject or content of both pottery brushed container from Susa and the much earlier cave paintings from Lascaux is animals. But what are the most striking differences between these animal images? Here's a hint. How would you describe the difference between the two elephants and the two donkeys? Well, obviously, the animals on top are used iconographically. That is, these animals are traditional symbols of the two political parties. The animals on top are also highly stylized, while the animals below are rendered much more naturalistically. So here are some more examples of pottery from Susa. Again, we see highly geometric forms. The ibex's body is composed of two connected triangles with an almost perfect semicircle below. The snake's head is shaped as a diamond. The work also relies heavily on rhythm. I especially like the repeated pattern of greyhounds that chase around the top of the ibex bushel. So how was the pottery made? Actually, art historians and archaeologists are still debating this. The pots are remarkably smooth, but they are not quite smooth enough to suggest a pottery wheel, although some scholars think the artist may have used a slow hand wheel. Certainly it is much easier to paint on a smooth surface, which is why pottery wheel pottery and papyrus, vellum, and finally paper all represent huge technological breakthroughs for art. The pot was found in What about context? Pottery first appeared during the Paleolithic era in East Asia before spreading to the Middle East and the Mediterranean basin during the Neolithic period, thousands of years later. You see some examples here. These are not required images. Pottery emerged in Persia around 8000 BCE, probably thanks to growing trade with the East. But this was also where two very important developments seem to have taken place. East Asian potters had fired or heated their ceramics, but Persians developed pit kilns. than stone-fired kilns, which allowed firing clay at much higher temperatures, and that improved the reliability and the durability of pots. In addition, the potter's wheel was probably invented and developed in Mesopotamia between 6000 and 4000 BCE, leading to a surge in ceramic vessels of all types and sizes. By the way, the pottery wheel was invented independently in other regions. The pot was found in a cemetery at the foot of the Susa Acropolis, a collection of public buildings on a hill. Because archaeologists have not found any dwellings, that is, places where people actually lived, in Susa, they really don't know if these were special ceremonial objects or examples of the pottery that was used in ordinary life. The content of the vase may, however, offer some hints about context. The Louvre Museum website notes that the bushel's visual motifs seem to represent the environment and social structure of this early river-based society, which was moving into the age of agriculture and settled communities. What's important is that the artists are capturing aspects of daily life, much like the Algerian cave artists, but they are rendering them in a stylized, abstracted, geometric form. Moving on to our next required work, would you call the form of this sculpture carved from bone stylized or naturalistic? I think it's remarkably naturalistic, and here is my evidence. The dog on the right is Tori, one of my two caissons. Note especially the resemblance around the snouts. Warning, my dogs will show up in lectures again, and you will sometimes hear them barking in the background of a podcast. They want to join the class. So, I hope you read a very interesting article on this work. The author theorizes that this was a ceremonial mask, quite possibly used in shamanistic rituals. And do you remember some of the evidence that the author uses to support this theory? Well, there is the sacrum bone itself, named that way because many cultures hold it sacred. It is associated with procreation and resurrection in a number of cultures around the globe. The author also relates the use of the sacrum to later mythology from the same geographical area. In Mesoamerican cosmology, spirits move back and forth between the spirit and earth worlds through openings depicted iconographically as the mouth and the anus, the skull and the sacrum. Again, please remember that without a written record, all of this is conjecture. Maybe the artist just really liked her dog. Next work. It is extraordinary to think that this stone sculpture was carved entirely with stone tools. But what was its function? This one's a little easier. It was almost certainly a mortar and pestle, a simple tool used to grind grain or roots to make them easier to cook and digest. The mortar and pestle on the left is from the Mayan civilization of Mesoamerica. Other mortars and pestles have been found in Papua New Guinea and dated from this time. But what animal are we seeing? The leading theory seems to be that this is the embryo of a now extinct form of anteater, an animal that had lots of yummy fat on its body and was therefore an excellent food source. But again, we don't know for sure. The photo on the right is the echidna's modern-day ancestor, the spiny anteater. The Metropolitan Museum of Art website, and you'll hear me refer to that a lot, it's a favorite source, notes that while we really don't know the function or meaning of this prehistoric work, it may have been a totemic symbol used in rituals. Totemic refers to a natural object or an animate being, such as an animal or a bird, that is used as the emblem or symbol of a clan, a family, or of a group. Remember that archaeologists thought that some of the motifs on the ibex beaker might have represented a clan, especially likely since it was found at a gravesite. What I find interesting about this description is that modern-day people of New Guinea assume that these images were made by the gods, and they use them as sacred objects in rituals. This is a terrific example of how art changes its meaning over time, which is a big theme of the College Board and of this course. Okay, last required work for today. There's actually some dispute about the origins of the Lapita people, but here's the most widely accepted theory. Around 1500 BC, a culture known as Lapita appeared in Oceania and then moved into more remote corners of the South Pacific. Recent DNA analysis suggests that they came from the islands of Southeast Asia. These migrants had learned to explore the open sea and survive, And importantly, they brought Neolithic technologies, including pottery. They also carried with them domesticated plants, including yam and coconut, and domesticated animals, including pigs and dogs. The Lapita are the ancestors of the Polynesians, including the Maori of New Zealand. Stay tuned for our unit on Pacific art. We will revisit this piece then. Archaeologists have mostly found just pottery shards or pieces, but the photo on the right shows a partly reconstructed Lapita pot. The pottery may have had ceremonial uses, but based on the shapes and where the shards were found, archaeologists guess that Lapita pottery was used primarily for everyday uses, cooking or storing food. Again, remember the context. A Neolithic culture where people were often on the move and which had the beginnings of established agriculture. Pottery was terrific for storage. Keep in mind, too, that not all highly decorated items have ritual or ceremonial uses. People decorate the beautiful things for use in everyday life. These photos also give us a glimpse of the technique that ceramic artists used. The patterns were incised into wet clay with a sharp, comb-like tool in elaborate patterns, and then the clay was then fired. What is the content of the ceramic art? Well, mostly we see repeated geometric patterns with a very defined rhythm, but we also see a recognizable, although very stylized human head. Was it a person? Or an ancestor or a god? We don't know. The geometric patterns themselves are fascinating. Let's watch just the first minute, of a video analyzing some of these patterns. Remember that when exploring the meaning of prehistoric art, historians and ethnographers often look to historic works by people who later inhabit the same area. It's a little tricky with the Lapita because this elaborate pottery died out and was replaced with much simpler ceramic art. Some scholars, however, suggest that these patterns live on in one of the most iconic forms of Pacific art, the tattoo. Here is a 19th century engraving of a Polynesian warrior from the Marquesa Islands. I tried to blow up a portion of the tattoo. The image on the right comes from another Lapita pottery fragment, again with rhythm and a combination of symbols and stylized human faces. We will return to faces, some very odd faces, in our last prehistoric art lesson.